I'm gonna go and get started. So, okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Justin Wright. I'm an attorney, and this session, as I think everyone knows, is on driving and narcolepsy, and driving laws on narcolepsy. First off, we have a couple of flyers that most people should have. If you don't have, I'd encourage you to get some. They're right here on the front row here. One is a spreadsheet that I've compiled that talks about the different laws of the different states, and another is a couple of handouts about some case studies that we're going to go through later. So if you don't have those, go ahead and grab one of those. At the end of the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about a survey that I'd like you to fill out. It takes a couple minutes of your time at a max. So let's start off with my disclaimer. I'm a lawyer. I like disclaimers. All of us kind of do. I'm a lawyer, and I am licensed in the state of Ohio. I'm not licensed in the state of Colorado or California or Minnesota, which means that I can't practice law in those states. But I can tell you what the laws in those states are, and I've done the research, and I will, to my best knowledge, I will do that. But I cannot tell you exactly what the law is in each one of your states. If you have a specific state law, specific question, I would encourage you to find a lawyer in the state that you're at. Here's a little preliminary advice. My strong suggestion to everyone, if you have narcolepsy, is to find a disability attorney in your state that you can ask questions and you can get advice from. After you've developed a relationship with an attorney, you should be able to contact them for advice, I like to say, without mortgaging your house for an obnoxious retainer. But I think it'll be well worth your effort if you're able to do that. The next thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is the spreadsheet that I handed out, or that should have been handed out. I know it's in kind of small font, but what this spreadsheet is a listing of the 50 states. It tells in the first category whether or not reporting is required of narcolepsy, of your condition, to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles or the agency in your state. The second is whether or not your physician has immunity for making that report, whether or not anonymous reporting is permitted, and then there's a column that says MAB. Does anyone know, as it relates to driving laws, what the acronym MAB means? Medical Advising Board, right. And other than law enforcement, I would argue that the MAB is probably the most important entity that most folks are going to deal with. Unfortunately, what you found in here is that there are a couple states that don't have an MAB, which puts folks with narcolepsy in a bit of a precarious situation. I'll explain why. So I'm not going to go through every one of the states, but I am going to hit some of the highs and the lows, if you will. When we look at Alaska, Alaska is self-report only. So that means if you have a problem with narcolepsy, you have to report yourself. There is no medical advising board. So what that tells me about the state of Alaska is that you've got a large geographic area, you have no medical reporting board, and you have law enforcement and other folks that are not making a report. And so I'd be pretty concerned if I was in the state of Alaska that something bad could happen. Let's look at some of the other ones. We look at Idaho. It has their permissive reporting, which means the law enforcement can report a narcoleptic to the MAB. But most impressively with Idaho is you have a small group of citizens and the sheriff that are your medical advising board. That's probably an issue. I doubt that your sheriff, and I doubt that the group of citizens, unless they're really well apportioned throughout your community, has a good idea of whether or not what narcolepsy is and how you can drive and whether you should or you shouldn't. So we have that. In Indiana, any medical condition at all needs to be reported within 60 days. In Kansas, you have to allow your doctor to report you. So if something happens in Kansas, you get into a bad accident, and your physician wants to report you to law enforcement, he has to actually get your signed consent. So, I mean, I would say that that's good, but it's not really good. It's just specific. In Massachusetts, if a report's made by law enforcement, you have 10 days to respond. If you don't respond in 10 days, you're licensed. I'll actually have a section for question and answer. I just have a lot of information, and so at the very end, I'll take a question and answer, and I promise I'll stay until the questions are done. But there's quite a bit of information here. In Michigan, The maximum that can be done to your license is re-examination. They can't suspend your license, but they can make you retake your test. In Minnesota, they immediately suspend your license upon any report. Pennsylvania probably has the most draconian rules. In Pennsylvania, practically any kind of condition that affects any part of your body has to be reported within 10 days. Also, the interesting thing about Pennsylvania is the rules specifically state that their medical advising board only has to meet once every 2 years. So if the authority decides to suspend your license because of that, it could be 2 years before you get a resolution. I don't practice in Pennsylvania. I don't know how often they actually do, but the fire is only held to them once every 2 years. In Vermont, a physician can report you, but again, only with your permission. So I'm not sure how effective that is. So when we look at all this, we get some trends. We see in the southern states and in rural states, it's kind of very hands-off. You'll see a lot of times where it'll be, in the reporting section, it will say encouraged, but then under physician immunity, it will say no. So essentially, you've got a situation where by statute, they're saying, doctors, we want you to make this report, but the physicians have no immunity to do that. They could either get in trouble from a criminal perspective, or they could get in trouble from a civil perspective, and what sleep physician is going to report you and possibly deal with a medical malpractice suit because of that? They're not going to. So some of these statutes are interesting to say the least. There certainly isn't any sort of consistency between the states. It's all very state-specific in terms of how they do that. Another thing about the Medical Advising Board is that you have the right, as a citizen, to know the methodology that they use. You also have the right to know what the makeup of the Medical Advising Board is. In some states, the Medical Advising Board is very representative, has specialists from every subsection. They're very well versed, and you can feel pretty comfortable if a report goes to the MAB that you're getting a good situation. In most places, that information isn't well known, but you do have a ability to request that, and you're allowed to ask outcomes. You're allowed to say, okay, if 12 reports go before your MAB, how many of those are recommended for suspension? How many of those are allowed to not do that? And you as patients have the ability to engage in a little bit of advocacy and say, look, on my medical advising board, there's not a single person that knows anything about sleep medicine. And I don't think they should be making that decision. So I think that's helpful. So this is the website that I think is one of the more important websites. I'd suggest, if you don't remember anything else, just get onto nhtsa.gov. What this does, this gives you a link to every state. It will give you information of what your application process is, what your appellate process is, how long your license will last, what the makeup of your medical advising board. It gives you everything, and everything that I used to compile this list came off of this website. And I picked the picture because I had a monkey on a computer, and I thought that was good. So, the next sort of subset we're going to talk about, and I think this is probably why a majority of people are in this session. I think the question that most people want to know, do I tell somebody that I have narcolepsy? Or if they find out, what's going to happen? Generally, I'm going to say that generally you don't want to say anything that you don't have to say. But at the same point, you don't want to lie. We're going to revisit why you don't want to lie, other than needing absolution from your priest. But we're going to talk about what the legal complications are here. Why do I say don't disclose anything more than you have to? I like to call it the Indiana example. I don't know if I don't have the information of who these people are, but a case in Indiana, 2011. Man and woman were in the middle of a very contentious divorce, and the wife decided that a good way to get at her husband was to make sure he didn't have a license. She was aware of the process. She told the Bureau of Motor Vehicles that he had narcolepsy. She knew that that was false. She intentionally did that. When she did that, she started a hellstorm that she probably didn't even know that she would begin. He went through a process of over 2 years where he had to go to doctors, and they said he doesn't have narcolepsy. But one of the doctors that he went to see from the BMV said, well, he's a little overweight, so maybe he has obstructive sleep apnea. They discovered that he didn't have OSA, but they put him on this program because they said, we think it's likely that you might have a problem. So every 3 months, he had to go in to them and prove that he was safe. Every time he didn't report on time, he had his license suspended for another year. So we have this poor guy that's being put through the ringer for no reason at all. Now, is that going to happen in every case? No. It's kind of crazy. I used to live in Indiana, and so I don't have a problem defaming them. I'm sorry if you're from Indiana. But that's one of the things that kind of happen when you get in the middle of this storm. And that's why I say, if you don't have to disclose, don't. But we're going to talk about why you should and why you shouldn't. So this is the question that you are going to likely, if you haven't already had to answer in your state, you will eventually have to go. You'll have to eventually answer this question. This is what all the Bureau of Motor Vehicles are asking. Do you have a disease of episodic unconsciousness? Now, first, it takes a little while. I'm not a physician, so it takes me a little while to figure out what in the world that means. But when you look at the definitions of narcolepsy, most people agree, even in states in which physicians have to report narcolepsy to the agency, most people believe that the definition of narcolepsy is not a disease of episodic unconsciousness. There is a disorder in which every person that has that disease has a disease of episodic unconsciousness. Does anyone know what that is? Epilepsy. Absolutely. An epileptic would always have to answer this question, yes, as a narcoleptic. My guidance is that you do not. And whether or not what the answer to that question is typically is in the discretion of your physician. And that's why the overarching idea of this session is stay in honest, constant communication with your doctor. That is your key to being able to continue to drive. And we'll keep going over that over and over as we talk about it. Let's talk about the application process a little bit. Anyone that's ever had a license knows how this works, but some of you have not had to go through the denial and the appeals process, and that's what we want to talk about if you're unfortunate enough to have to do that. And we'll get to that later. The original process, you're going to fill out an application, and you're either going to have to get or renew your license about every 4 years. Some states as little as 2 years, some states as many as 8. But typically every 4 years, you're going to fill out an application in which you're going to be asked that question about episodic unconsciousness, probably. If you go through that process and your application is not denied, if it's allowed, but if they find out later that you were not honest on your application, one thing that can happen, let's say they change the question. Let's say it's not whether or not you have a disease of episodic unconsciousness. What if the question is, do you have a condition that could affect your ability to drive safely? Raise your hand if you have narcolepsy, if you're in this room, whether you would answer yes to that question. Okay. I would argue if you have narcolepsy, you need to answer yes to that question. Here's what happens. If they find afterwards that if they ask that question, you don't, first of all, your license could be taken away. It could be taken away at the time they discover it, or it could happen retroactively. If they say that you should have known and you said that falsely, they're going to consider that fraud. So the agency will retroactively take away your license. If that happens and you get pulled over, then you're going to get charged with driving without a license, even if you thought you had one because you lied on the application. You're going to get in trouble from an insurance perspective because some states take your insurance application directly from your DMV information, and you could get in trouble for that as well. So that's why we probably want to be careful about that. Now let's assume that your license application gets denied or through this process gets revoked. What do? You can appeal that decision to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. If they ratify that, they say that they think it's proper for you not to have a license, then you can appeal that to the commissioner of the Bureau. And then finally, if that doesn't happen, you have the ability to have a lawsuit in which you could sue the commissioner of the BMV in a court. Now, here's one thing to keep in mind. And we kind of all know this in the back of our head, but sometimes don't remember. Driving is not a right. It's not a constitutional right or a state law right. It's a privilege, and we have to follow a bunch of specific reasons why we can't do that. One of the reasons the lawsuit to the commissioner is probably very difficult is because that individual has something called sovereign immunity. That means that you can't sue him in the course of his job unless he's done something outrageous. And you're going to have to prove that he specifically kind of had it in for you. So it's a difficult burden typically to be able to do that. Now, and that's kind of what this is about. There's a very small likelihood that any of this would ever, that anyone would be looking at jail time. But, like I said, if the question is episodic impairment, I think as a narcoleptic you can always answer yes, unless your state licensing authority changes the definition of narcolepsy to include that. But if the question is, do you have a condition which may affect your ability to drive a car safely, I think you need to be honest about that. I think what you're looking at as a possible consequence is more difficult than the process that you're going to have to do in order to make sure that you can drive that carefully. Actually, we do, honestly, we've got a lot of information, and I'll be happy to answer at the end if you want to maybe just write it down for a second. So let's talk a little bit about kind of trends. I want you to know that there are states, and there are legislatures within those states at the state level and at the national level that want to compare narcolepsy with other disorders and diseases, mainly epilepsy. And again, the burden is essentially switched on the epileptic driver. The burden right now is that the state would have to prove that you were not safe in order to continue this, in order to take your license away. The burden is different once you've disclosed that you have epilepsy. Then the burden is on you to prove that you're safe. It's a different burden. So it's not the case now that narcolepsy is like epilepsy, but that's not impossible. It's not impossible for narcolepsy to become in that category. What could happen? I like to say national problems will get a national result. If there are a significant number of narcoleptic accidents with folks that shouldn't have been driving and were, it would not be uncommon for the NHTSA commissioner to have a conference call with the boards of BMVs around the country and say, if you guys don't take care of this, we're going to. And that's one of the possible concerns. Let's talk about a couple of case studies that kind of illustrate instances that might trigger something like that. So we're going to go to this handout that we had. First, we're going to talk about the first one on here. This is a case from Maine, and I'm just going to skim this information because again, I know we have a lot of questions and we've got a lot of information. Essentially, what happened in this case in Maine, you can look at it later in depth, or you can read it as we're going through it. Essentially, this is an individual who we can't tell whether or not she was treated or not treated. What we do know is she had consistently would fall asleep at the wheel. It was known throughout the community. She had several accidents, and law enforcement made report after report after report and said, look, this person is unsafe. But somehow in Maine, it fell through the cracks. And they finally got to the point where law enforcement is frustrated because they continue to make a report, and apparently this particular driver has continued to drive. So this is the sort of time when we've got a process in place. Maine has a good process. They have a good medical advisory board, but things are falling through the cracks, and a possible bad accident could happen in this case. Now let's compare that with the second instance, which is a little more severe. And this is in Australia. In this case, this obviously didn't happen here, but this was an individual who had to go doctor shopping to find a doctor that would say that it was okay for him to drive. Unfortunately, he was not. They have a law called Jet's Law in Australia that says that you're not supposed to do this. He disagreed with that. He decided to go ahead and drive anyway when he wasn't treated. He killed his fiancée. He was sent to prison for 4 years and permanently banned from driving. These are the sorts of things that could allow narcolepsy to go from where it's at, which is a pretty good position, to be frank, as it relates to other disabilities, to where it could be considered more into an epileptic sense. Let me also say this. My interest in narcolepsy is based on the fact that my fiance, Dr. Rogers, has a clinical interest in narcolepsy. I talk to narcolepsy patients on a fairly regular basis, and 99% of the drivers that I talk to are very safe, are very aware of their limitations, and this isn't an issue. But we've got an increasing pediatric narcoleptic population. We've got it seems to be an increasing narcoleptic population in general. And I think one of the keys here is that everyone who this affects understands that that all narcoleptics are going to be bunched into one big category if something bad happens. There may be 99 really great narcoleptic drivers, and there may be one irresponsible narcoleptic driver that if it becomes such a situation that it can't be disregarded by media and by national decision makers, it will become a national response. So let's go on and talk a little bit about sort of advocacy issues. Or actually, let's talk about driving in narcolepsy. I'm not going to hit this very hard. I don't think there's the need for it, but I'm going to go over it a little bit. And I talked about this in the juvenile session. The NIH data, the Harvard study, as well as another federal study, makes it pretty clear the narcoleptic patients, even treated narcoleptic patients, have a higher incidence of accident than non-narcoleptic patients. We also know that perfectly treated narcoleptics still will not get to the same level of wakefulness that somebody without narcolepsy is. So there's an increased risk there. I guess the issue is in terms of what to do as a narcoleptic driver. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. The most important thing you can do to make sure that you and everyone else can consistently drive and be safe is to have a consistent, frank conversation with your doctor. I said this in the other session as well. I had a conversation with somebody that told me that they can only drive safely for 10 to 15 minutes. And I said, well, can you drive safely then? And they said, well, yeah, as long as I'm only on the road for 15 minutes. And my question is, how can you tell me that you're only going to be on the road for 15 minutes? Where I live in Ohio, there's a fair number of trains. There's a fair number of other things. Sometimes things happen that we don't know of. So I guess my advice, if you can only stay awake for 15 minutes, is that that's probably not safe driving. And you're probably putting yourself and other people at risk. In terms of advocacy issues, I think more education probably needs to be done. Not in the, I don't think as much in the narcoleptic community, but in the non-narcoleptic community in terms of what narcolepsy is. I think that includes, I would very much doubt that your legislatures or the majority of your medical advisory boards really understand the disease. And I think that's a problem. I think that, again, I talked about the makeup of the medical advisory boards. I think that if your medical advisory board in your state doesn't have a sleep specialist on it, they need one. And I think you can provide some pressure, and I think the Narcolepsy Network, as your advocacy group, can probably help you with that. But I think most state MABs need to have somebody that has sleep specialty in their background. I think there needs to be continued vigilant fighting of some unfair stereotypes in driving. If there were any, corporate executives from Honda, I'd be looking straight at you. And I think most of the people know how that worked. Essentially, Honda made an ad that essentially said that it's not safe to drive if you're narcoleptic. Mark Patterson, part of the board, jumped right on that and got an apology from narcolepsy or from Honda. And I think that's been remedied, but that's a very clear issue. They thought that was a cute marketing ploy. It wasn't a cute marketing ploy. It negatively affected everyone that suffers with narcolepsy around the country, with somebody that makes a lot of money off of everyone. So I think a continued vigilant fighting of that is important. I think narcolepsy needs to be understood for what it is and what it isn't. Somebody asked me as I was creating this, one of my colleagues said, why are you doing this session? Why would you take the time to do this? Is it that important? There was a book a few years ago called The Psychosocial Aspects of Narcolepsy. It stated that there's a direct, tangible correlation between life happiness in narcolepsy and the ability to safely and legally drive a car. To me, that's not a surprise. Dr. Rogers, on occasion, in her practice, will see elderly individuals, and one of the most difficult decisions and conversations that she'll have is telling an elderly individual you're no longer safe to drive a car. So I don't think that's a surprise. And I think driving a car is kind of the last vanguard. You can have a lot of things taken away from you, and you can have to deal with a lot of things. But if you are by yourself and you don't have a support network, and you can't drive a vehicle, your sense of hopelessness, I think, goes from 0 to 100. I think it's very difficult. It's very difficult to deal with what your day is normally like if you can't drive. I think when you really study the different states and the way that the breakup is and how the process is stated, I think narcolepsy has benefited more from being lucky than being good. I think they've benefited from happenstance, not design. And at some point, I think that there needs to be consistency within the states, and there needs to be more of a situation than what we currently have. And I think if there isn't a dedicated campaign at some point to make consistency and education a priority, with these boards that have huge abilities to control whether or not you drive, I think some of the doomsday scenarios might happen. There might be a wreck or a couple wrecks. There might be an individual that drives a bus that has narcolepsy and a bunch of kids die. Those are the sorts of doomsday things that that there doesn't need to be very many of to cause a big issue. To that end, myself and Dr. Rogers have compiled a survey. It's very small. It's here in the front of the room. It'll take 5 minutes of your time, but I'd ask you to fill it out. There are probably more people in here than I have surveys left, and that's good. Here's the goal of the survey. I want to know some basic things about your driving habits. I want to know about conversations that you had with your doctor. After I get those results, I'm going to compile this and I'm going to send this to sleep doctors around the country. And I want to know what conversations they're having with you. The point of this, we're going to put those results together and we're going to put them at next year's conference. My hope is that with this, we have enough information that we can design a plan where narcolepsy can become the beneficiary of this planned and developed strategy that can ensure that narcoleptics continue to have the privilege to drive as long as you can do so safely. I think if we continue to wait or to hope that some bad situation doesn't come up, I think that some of these situations are more likely. And I think at that point, then narcolepsy starts to become lumped into a category that they don't want to be lumped into. And I think it negatively affects probably everyone with a diagnosis. So thank you very much. That's the end of that. At the end of the session, we're all done with the Q&A. Please grab one of the surveys. And let me check on time. We're very good. Okay, so now any questions and answers, please. Yes, ma'am.
I did have a question about medicated and driving.
Yes.
You said that you probably are not full for this. Let me try. I have probably had, I know I can, narcolepsy in my life.
Mm-hmm.
But I did not get diagnosed until I took my car.
Sure.
Because I fell asleep.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
They were 3 blocks from home.
Yes.
And now that I'm medicated, I know I can drive.
Mm-hmm.
All the way to our lake house, that's 5 hours away.
Okay.
I have.
Right, that's great.
But you don't think that, so I would definitely answer that question, that I don't have any. I don't
You mean in terms of the question about whether or not you have a condition that could affect your ability to safely operate a vehicle?
I wouldn't even talk twice about it.
And I guess the only inclination that I would have is if the wording of it says, do you have a condition that, and my interpretation of that, and I think the interpretation that most bureaus would take, is that narcolepsy itself can manifest itself in lots of ways. In certain people it can affect their abilities, and certain people it can't. So my interpretation of when they ask the question, do you have a condition that could cause that? I think the answer to that probably has to be yes. In your case, it doesn't seem like it does. But do you have a condition in which that would be a possibility in some instance? And my argument to that would be that you would have to answer that yes.
It would have before,
Right.
but not now.
Mm-hmm.
But you still have the same condition.
Right. Yeah.
You just medicated. You
Right.
just.
Yeah, so I.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
So I live in Wisconsin, we have a 15-year-old with narcolepsy.
Yes.
Bottom is, it says, I'm guessing that we're pretty good state that because it says MAB significant representation.
Yes.
Is that good?
Yes. Your MAB has very good representation, certainly in neurology and in some of the other movement disorders. And in Wisconsin, we look through there. It's encouraged. Physicians have immunity, which means that they're going to feel comfortable that they can report when they need to, but they're not required to. So when they see a situation that's not safe, they can report it to that. Now I didn't, let me go through this overview really quickly and I'll answer your question, sir, as soon as I'm done with this. As soon as law enforcement or somebody makes a report to your Bureau of Motor Vehicles, if they have an MAB, then that report will go directly to the MAB. If the state allows for an immediate license suspension, then they'll immediately suspend your license, then they'll call you in. Some states won't do that. They'll just call you in for an interview and they'll decide whether or not you need anything additional. So that's what the process is typically like. Yes, sir. You had a question back there.
Can you describe in more detail what you're heading to in this matrix? So medical reporting required by whom or
I'm sorry. Okay, so medical reporting required means that is your condition of narcolepsy, in this case, is your narcolepsy required to be reported by your doctor to the board? Okay, so in California, you're required to do it. In fact, in California, if you don't do it, you can be fined and you can actually go to jail. So there's some kind of heavy-handed rules in certain states. In Pennsylvania, like I said, in California, narcolepsy would have to be reported, and some other disorders may have to be reported, but not everything. My understanding in Pennsylvania is darn near everything you have has to be reported and has to be done within 10 days. So that's a difficult requirement. Yes, ma'am.
I'm from Colorado, which apparently doesn't have an MAB. What does that
Correct.
mean?
Well, what it means is that your bureau is making that decision. That means that if you're a physician, and by bureau I mean Bureau of Motor Vehicles, your physician, if they believe that you are in danger, or you're in danger to yourself or others, they're going to make a report to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. And now, the link that I was provided, it just said whether or not there was an MAB. There may be an option in Colorado that doesn't call itself a medical advising board that does the same thing. The only thing I know is from this listing, it didn't say. I would be concerned if I was in a state that didn't have any kind of process like that, because that means that you have a bunch of people that have worked for the DMV that are making that decision. And I'm sure they're very good at what they do, but I don't think that they understand the specifics of narcolepsy and whether or not you're safe to drive. Yes, sir.
Still, this was permissive.
Permissive means that it's allowed. So permissive means that a doctor can report that if they want to. Required, of course, means that they have to. And in some states, and sometimes it's encouraged.
I live in Texas, and this is just, I would say about 5 years ago, the neurologists were saying, if we write down that you have narcolepsy, we must turn this into wherever, and if we don't, the day we're liable. But I don't see
Right.
that now. It's-
Yeah, I would disagree with that assessment. And I think a lot of times, I'll hear this report from clients and actually physicians as well. Sometimes physicians will go a little bit over. They'll say, look, I have to report and the reason that they're covering their own, okay?
Right.
But in a strict legal sense, do they, in Texas, does your physician have to report you if you say narcolepsy? I'm telling you no. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about your thoughts that somebody who says they feel comfortable driving for 15 minutes, and you said then I wouldn't drive. I mean, it seems to me like somebody like that has an awareness and they know after 10 minutes I'm going to pull over.
The only problem I have with that, and I would agree with half of that. I would agree with the part that they are very vigilant about what's going on. My only concern is, having driven for a little bit myself, is that I'm just concerned that you can restrict your driving to 15 minutes. If you are only going, my fiance's grandmother, she's 88 years old, she's very independent, and the only driving she does is back and forth to the grocery store, and that's within about 5 to 6 miles. In that instance, I think she can pretty consistently say, I'm only going to be on the road 15 minutes. So if you're geographically limited in that way, you don't do much driving, and you can be reasonably certain that you're only going to be driving that much time, and there are practically no circumstances that would have you on the road for more than 15 minutes, then yes, by all means, I'd say that you're safe to drive. But if you're not, and you can't do that, and you say 90% of the time I'm safe and 10% of the time I'm not, 10% can cause something. And I would be, like I said, I'd be concerned about that. No, I'm not a physician. I'm not qualified to say whether medically you're allowed to do that. And please don't ask me any medical questions. But from a legal perspective, I'd be concerned. Yes, ma'am.
What's the point, going back to that question, the condition that,
Yes, episodic
what's the
unconscious.
point of answering that yes? If you answer it yes, is that a red flag?
If you answer it yes, then yes. At that point, it becomes at that point, if you say you have narcolepsy, then it's going to get pushed. If it happened, it may be, it's going to go to the medical advising board. They're going to look at your condition. They may require you to go to a doctor and get a letter that says that you're safe to drive. And that's again where we go back to this issue of what's the most important way to make sure you can continue to drive. Have frank, honest, and consistent communication with your doctor. Because even whether or not they report you in a mandatory reporting state is still completely up to their discretion in 90% of the time. So having that conversation with them, making sure between you and them that you guys are comfortable that you can safely drive is the #1 way to stay on the right side of this line. Yes, ma'am.
What if you're in a state that's permissive?
Yes.
And you have a 16-year-old driver that the physician made this way when he signed off that she could drive.
Okay.
She kept her learner's permit twice and never went and got a driver's license. She's now 25.
Okay.
And she had gone through a number of years of reporting it to the DMV.
Right.
But then they said, no more refund. Now she's thinking about writing again. But she's thinking about not declaring.
Okay.
Or she's trying to evaluate whether she should.
Right.
What kind of position is she in since it has already been declared for her?
That cat is already out of that bag. And if she says that I don't have narcolepsy at this point, my guess is, depending on their paperwork, my guess is they're going to look at any previous applications. That's what the typical process is. So at that point, again, we're in a situation where they know, somewhere within that organization, they know that she's not being truthful, and that when she decides that she's going to say that she doesn't have narcolepsy, then we're looking at some of these issues. We're looking at some of these possible insurance issues. We're looking at some of these possible criminal
No
issues.
matter which one of those positions they have, whether it's the episodic.
No, as soon as she's admitted that she has narcolepsy, then, well, I'm going to change my mind on that. It wouldn't matter. If the question is whether or not she has episodic unconsciousness, then I think she can say no. Now they can further question her and say, hey, but you said you had narcolepsy at that point, and I think she's completely in the clear, and I'm sure her physician would say no, she doesn't have a condition that's characterized by episodic unconsciousness. But if it's safe driving, I think they would have a problem with that. I've got some people in the back, and I'm sorry, so I'll come back to you guys with that. Yes, sir. Okay. Yes,
I
right
had
there.
a question. You know, when you're comparing the relative risk of normal drivers to this narcolepsy group of drivers,
Yes, sir.
the rate of accidents is higher, so there's
Yes.
a higher risk. Within the normal group drivers, there are various subgroups
Absolutely.
that are at much higher risk. So how have you taken that sample?
Well, it's not me. That's from,
whoever made it.
right. Well, these numbers come from a 10-year study that was done by the federal government, and they looked at truck drivers. Truck drivers who had narcolepsy and truck drivers who didn't have narcolepsy. And they actually have levels of how strong they believe their analysis is. So they'll have a question, do treated narcoleptic drivers, are they at an increased risk as opposed to non-narcoleptic drivers? And they believe that the evidence was strong in that regard. So that's where that information comes from. It comes from that study. I believe that's a relatively old study. I want to say that it's around 2000 and started around 1990. So that's where that information comes from, that essentially there is an increased risk, even when treated, of a narcoleptic driver becoming in an accident. Now, that's sort of, that's comparing a narcoleptic driver to sort of the perfect non-narcoleptic driver. Are there plenty of folks that you guys are around on a daily basis that are texting on their phone and are tired from working a third job and are doing a bunch of other stupid things that might make them a much worse driver than you when you're treated? Absolutely. Absolutely. But that was the study and the information they came from. I think the take home from that isn't that narcoleptics are bad drivers. I think the take home is that there are some risk factors there that everyone needs to be aware of. And as long as we're aware of it, and as long as we're talking to our doctor, and we're making sure that we're treated and we're taken care of and we're aware of the risks, then I think we're in a good position. But if we become cavalier about that, and we're not as concerned about it, and we think that it's okay, then I think we open the door. Yes, ma'am, right in the back.
Yeah, so I have a statement and a question. To add on to what you're saying. So you're probably aware that this Tuesday, October 21st, Dr. Rosenkranz, who's the chairman of the NTSB, is going to have a hearing laws about drowsy driving, which would impact the general public, how that would kind of drag in people with conditions
Okay.
that would be.
First, let's talk about how we come up with drowsy driving statistics. Drowsy driving statistics are made from public reports. Okay, so other than self-reports, the only way that we find out about drowsy driving information is somebody gets an accident and the officer says what happened and he says I fell asleep. Don't have any idea whether they fell asleep because they were tired, because they were drunk, or because they had narcolepsy. And that information isn't collected, and we're just not sure about that. So the only way we get narcoleptic information about that is when we get that information, we've got to get a release of information to talk to the person who was in an accident. We ask them if they had narcolepsy, and we're relying on their self-report. So if there were additional laws that were passed by NHTSA about drowsy driving, yes, that would affect narcoleptics. But that isn't something I'm concerned with from a macro perspective, a big perspective. What I'm concerned with is if we have the boards, the commissioners of the individual boards of motor vehicle, at some point redefine narcolepsy based on their interpretation and say, now we believe this is what it is. Right now we know that AASM's definition and the APA definition do not make it, again, a condition of episodic unconsciousness. The concern would be is if at some point it does become that in an attempt to further restrict it. The reason I did this session mostly was because I had an individual that contacted me that said, in my state of Ohio, and said, this narcoleptic driver got her license taken away because she was untreated, and now there's a rule in Ohio that says no narcoleptic in Ohio can drive. And there was a group of people that were really upset about it and said, oh my gosh, no one can drive. And I said, settle down, hold on. There's a bunch of steps from the time that one individual narcoleptic gets in trouble for an issue to the entire group being affected. But I think it's worth having a session like this to talk about what the chances are to make sure that doesn't happen. Yes, ma'am. 5 minutes? Okay. And in the back, sir.
Simple comment regarding the safety of it. I used to be a CDL driver, driving in the snowplow. We were in the county 50 miles north of here.
Can you stand up, please?
I used to have had a CDL to keep the drive like that. And at that time, I was driving with narcolepsy, with epilepsy, and immediately lost my CDL. That meant I lost my job and everything with it. But to be honest with you, I'd rather be without the ability to drive because I hate it. I don't get up to the mountains to do anything anymore or nothing like that. I don't get to go to the grocery store if it's too icy, too rainy, because I might have an episode on the way. The long and short of it is, I would encourage you to be serious about it, because if we don't take it seriously the way you're advocating, we're all going to be lumped together as bad as I have it, and you may be fine to drive. Me, not so. You know, I hate to have about 40 tons of steel on the road and not know what you're doing.
Thank you for your comment, and I agree entirely. And that's really the point of this. Yes, ma'am. Right. Yeah.
Two things. One is, so if are there states who might restrict your driving versus suspend your license? Are there any degrees?
Okay.
Or is it
Yes,
like-
absolutely. So once the report goes to the medical advising board, then they will interview you and they'll ask you what, and they may ask you to get a letter from your doctor saying you're safe. After they get that letter, they may have their own physician interview and take a look at you, and they may say, we believe you can only drive safely for 4 hours, so we're going to give you a restricted license. It says that you can only do it for that amount of time, and that, essentially it's going to be a piece of paper from the agency, and you're going to have to keep that along with your license. And you will have to, typically people that have a restricted license, instead of being renewed, get their license renewed every 4 years, they're going to have to come in usually at least once a year for re-examination to determine whether or not their restrictions should be lifted entirely or should be made even more strict. And that's the situation that most people want to stay away from. But unfortunately, sometimes it happens, depending on your state. Yes, sir.
He recognizes when he's excessively.
The initial advice that I gave about having a disability lawyer that you can talk to would be very applicable there.
Where was that? Where?
Michigan.
Yeah. So in that case, we've got another situation where education is important. Clearly, and Dr. Rogers just talked about in our session over there, where some physicians that should know more about narcolepsy don't. We've also got other people. We've got paramedics and other things. I would disagree with their responsibilities, both from a malpractice standpoint, and certainly from a legal standpoint. I don't think that's right. Just because a narcoleptic happens to be taking a nap does not mean they're completely untreated. And frankly, the burden is not on that kid. The burden is not on your son to prove to them that he's treated.
Not to mention the nap is treatment.
Right. So I'm kind of offended on a couple levels there. The burden is not on him. The burden is on them to prove that there's something wrong with him until and unless they change this burden and make narcolepsy more like epilepsy.
He is right to refuse care.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering if you or others in the room have constructive strategies for how to successfully drive and stay awake. And I think that would be very valuable shared.
And that's
What-
on our survey as well.
Yeah,
We're asking for-
that's one of the things we're asking for in the survey. And what I've seen, I'm not, I don't see clients from it or patients from a medical perspective, just from a legal perspective. The ones that are successful, the only strategy that I see that is significantly successful is pulling over and getting sleep. That's the only one. And I've tried it myself. When I'm tired, I used to go from Minnesota to Ohio, and I do this and I slap myself, and I don't have narcolepsy. And people would come, they'd come beside my car and they'd see me go, what's wrong with this guy? Those things, my knowledge, and from talking to Dr. Rogers, a sleep debt will not be fixed by any of those. It will make you think that you're more awake, but it won't fix the issue. And I've never seen somebody that's been successfully done otherwise. Yes, ma'am.
But so I have a car that I have lane departure warning, I've got alertness things, I've got all sorts of things, and that helps me a lot because I'm not a person that knows when I'm going to fall asleep. And so it tells me that I'm having a problem, and it allows me then to pull over. And those kinds of things to me, it's made a huge difference in my confidence of driving.
There's also some pretty decent technology issues. Fitbit has some even more issues in terms of telling you when you're sleeping and when you're not. So I think there's some other things that are available there. Yes, sir.
Wanted to make 2 points. One of them, Dr. Rogers talked, just because you think you're okay to get behind the wheel doesn't mean you're not impaired. And if you get stopped and you appear impaired in 50 states of the union, you're going to get a ticket. You're going to jail. Okay? And secondly, if you decide to open the Pandora's box and take stimulants for alertness, you had better have your script in hand and hand it right along with your driver's license. Because if you don't, and you have been into taking stimulants for alertness, you're going to jail.
Well, let's actually talk a little bit about stimulants as it relates. We did this in juvenile session too, but I think this is something most people probably are not aware of. DUI does not just include alcohol. It just doesn't include illicit drugs. DUI includes your prescription meds. DUI can be aspirin. You can take a medication according to the label and according to your doctor's requirements, but if it affects you in a way that you can no longer adequately control your vehicle that's driving under the influence. So when you're titrating your meds, when you're getting a new med, you need to know how that affects you long before you get inside the vehicle. Because you could literally be taking, say you're on Concerta, you could be on Concerta, you could be taking it for a long time, you could know how it's going to affect you. Or you got a cold, you had something else, and I'm not a physician, so I don't know what the contraindications are there. But it could affect you in that particular time, and you could swerve and not be able to control your car, and you get pulled over and you get a ticket for DUI, and you're looking at that and you're like, are you kidding? But that, in a strict sense, would be DUI. So it's something to keep in mind, something to keep kind of in your back pocket. That's probably not something your doctor's going to tell you. He's probably going to tell you, watch it. He's probably going to tell you, hey, you might end up getting pulled over for DUI because I don't care.
We don't know that. That's not, that sort of question is not really ours.
It does. It does, but I can't count the number of clients that come to my office and say, Mr. Wright, I know I should have done that, but I did it anyway. I think a lot of times we look at disclaimers and we look at labels and sometimes we don't pay attention to them. Sometimes we do, but I think sometimes we don't. How much time do we have left? We're done? Okay. Well, I'm going to end the session at this point. I'm going to stay here. Like I said, I'll take questions while they're here. So if you have any questions, come up and see me. I'll be happy to answer. Thank you very much.